Hey, what's up, everyone? I wanted to do a live stream here to primarily highlight an article that I think needs a lot of attention. It's an article that Scott Johnson wrote at the expandeduniverse.com called Continuation, What Would It Look Like? And what I think I just going to do is I'm just going to share this screen. This might be sort of just sort of improvising here. I don't really have any sort of prepared thoughts here, but I want to just sort of pull it up and kind of walk through it. Um, I don't know if you guys have had a chance to read this yet. I I thought it was very thought provoking for a variety of reasons. I think that continuation is something that we can't always take for granted. And I think we've spent maybe a couple of years sort of having to build back the idea that continuation is something that is important, is something that should be argued for. Doesn't mean you have to be an EU fan, but I don't think there's anything inconsistent with being an EU fan, wanting to see more, even if you are skeptical about, say, what it would look like under Disney, or maybe you think that the EU sort of had its day and the end of the EU was fine. You could still sort of like, in principle, sort of let other people sort of think that this is a good thing to sort of, argue for, right? There's lots of good reasons to argue for continuation. I think we got out of a period where the last couple of years where I think we built back up the idea that continuation is important. I think we've got a really good sense of what all the arguments are for why continuation matters. I've done videos about this, written articles about this. There's other articles at the site about this. But what's so neat about what Scott does here is he wants to kind of say, okay, we believe in continuation, but what's the vision for going forward? What does it actually look like? And I think what's neat about this is it continues to get us to talk about continuation, but to start thinking about it kind of in different ways. So um, he's got a really neat sort of background here, kind of gets us up to speed. What happened 10 years ago? Where are we at? Um, recognizes that this is, as he says, sort of a spicy topic again. And I think that reflects that over the last couple of years, we were no longer able to take for granted that continuation was something either some fans wanted or that in some cases some fans even understood. And I still occasionally find in different pockets of the fandom places that I think should at least understand that this is a goal of some fans who has seemingly have never heard the idea or think about it in such a black and white way that they seem to miss the last 10 years of nuance about what we mean by continuation. Does it mean that we want the new canon to end and the EU to be returned? No, it's not going to work that way. We've always talked about a continuation along a parallel path, multiple storylines, right? The way that every other IP has different storylines, the way that there's a Marvel cinematic universe and then a comic book universe and then Marvel animated series and so on and so forth, right? All these things run sort of parallel, right? Star Wars is the only major IP that doesn't have parallel storylines, right? The EU, continuing the EU is the way to do that. But okay, spicy topic, right? This is background. It's well known that shortly after 2014, Lucasfilm decided to reboot the continuity and effectively end the expanded universe storyline, barring a few exceptions, of course, things like SWTOR and Marvel 108 and Fantasy Flight, sort of, opportunities to sort of expand the EU lore. Many fans have pleaded and called on Lucasfilm to reconsider, reinstating or continuing the EU. Although efforts were made to demonize fans, and this is so true, and this cannot be taken for granted. After this happened, having done nothing to anybody, right? We all woke up as fans April 25th, 2014, and all of a sudden became the problem, right? Um, the storyline that we'd invested in for 30 years and spent millions of dollars on, and were ready to do so for another 30 years, all of a sudden was gone, and we were the problem. Um, Everyone in the mainstream said that we were losers for liking this old thing. They had to just give it up. They said, after all, J.J. Abrams isn't coming to your house to take your stories away. You still got your, pat. That we got pat on the head and said, if you really like Star Wars, the old Star Wars that much, just read it, right? Just sit over there and just, be the loser. We had the mainstream Star Wars influencers coming after us, telling us it was time to move on. We have, and to this day, we have people saying things like, "Hey, you didn't lose a continuity; you gained a new continuity in the form of this new canon. So just get over it, right?" But again, we were the problem for sort of like wondering just what the heck had happened April 25th, right? Even though we'd seen the writing on the wall, we knew there was going to be something changing to what we understood as what the online, or the ongoing continuity would be. None of us thought it was going to be a wholesale reboot. But he says, while a few went as far as denouncing EU fans as problematic or toxic, EU fans themselves, and even many level-headed general Star Wars fans, were largely united in the idea that continuation would be a good thing again. And as I've said for 10 years, in principle, What stands in the way, and why wouldn't you in principle support this, right? You may not actually think it's possible. There may be reasons why you'd be skeptical about what comes, but in principle, give it a try. Continuation, right? It got stopped in a way that just simply needs to get picked back up again along a parallel path. More Star Wars would be good for everyone. We've always said that. More EU, more new canon, right? Let's let the new canon fans get more of their stuff. The EU fans, the older fans, get more of their stuff, right? And as it turns out, obviously lots of fans of the new canon are fans of the old, right? So it's not as if there's this stark contrast between the two, and it's not as if the EU fandom is this tiny little niche thing out there in the broader world, right? Essentially every Star Wars fan is an EU fan. If all you did was pump one quarter into Episode One Eraser at an arcade 20 years ago and liked it, you're an EU fan, right? So there's not this stark dichotomy, right? A lot of times what people want to do is belittle even the idea of an EU fandom, let alone the idea of continuation, by saying, it's just this tiny little minority of people. Obviously, it's a smaller segment when compartmentalized of the broader Star Wars fandom, but again, there's such overlap, right? And increasingly, the way the new canon takes ideas from the old expanded universe, obviously, new canon fans are being exposed and enjoying, in essence, the EU all the time. It says, however, now in 2024, after witnessing 10 years of Star Wars content under new canon, some EU fans even oppose the idea of Lucasfilm or their licensees creating new EU story material for fear of jeopardizing the quality of that content. There's an interesting thing embedded in here that often needs to be sort of like deconstructed. A lot of times people say, I don't like Lucasfilm, I don't want their content. Well, it's the licensees doing the work, right? In most cases, obviously Lucasfilm makes some movies, or Lucasfilm maybe makes some TV shows now for the new canon on Disney Plus, but it's the licensees who for years we trusted, right? We loved Del Rey, we loved Dark Horse, we loved all the RPG licensees, right? They're the ones that are doing the work. They're the ones getting the license to actually do the work to help sort of continue the expanded universe. They were a major pillar of keeping the expanded universe what it was. So I think we still have faith in them, even if some people have become skeptical of Lucasfilm. But there's oftentimes just this sort of leap to say, well, we don't want Lucasfilm sort of doing, or we don't want Disney doing these things to the EU. Well, it's the licensees that are the ones sort of doing the majority of the work, and not even the licensees, but then the authors and the contributors that they bring on, right? Who presumably have some interest in making the EU something quality, right? They don't want to get in just to write a bunch of crap. Lucas, some of the licensees are so distrusted by some of these fans that the few drips and drops we've gotten, as I've already mentioned, are sometimes dismissed or ignored or given their due consideration. And this is so true. I mean, I remember when Marvel 108 came out in 2019, there were tons of fans who were seemingly sort of like had spent the last 5 years sort of waiting for something like this to come, who just instantly sort of shit all over it. And in some cases, to find out they hadn't even read it yet. They say, oh, I've heard there's a bunch of contradictions there. It's like, oh, like name one, and then they go, oh, well, I didn't think it was very good. Really? Why? I don't know. I haven't read it yet, as it turns out, Marvel 108 sold extremely well, better than most of the new canon comics at the time. And historically, if you can compare the numbers with pre-2014 numbers, it was actually outselling pre-2014 comics numbers on the whole. So it did very well. However, it could have done better. And I think that, again, this sort of sense has always been with us for 10 years, that there's just some people who are just so skeptical of anything new post-2014 that they don't know how to recognize sort of progress when it comes, right? Something like Marvel 108 was an obvious success. It proved what they told us in 2014, that the EU was gone, right? It was gone for good. Well, no. So we got SWTOR, we got continuation in Fantasy Flight, and we got Marvel 108. And we're still getting SWTOR expansions. Which again, in general, sort of just disproves the point. People say, the EU is not coming back, get over it. Well, it's actually kind of still here. And that's the sort of the nuance that they sort of misunderstand when we go about arguing these things, which I think makes conversation about continuation all the more difficult. Scott goes on to say that lately this has caused civil strife amongst EU fans, some of the former feeling alienated by EU fandom for their understandable reservations regarding the quality of any possible continuation. Yeah, and I have to say, look, I get it. I understand the skepticism. I understand the concern. I just happen to believe that it's still worth trying, right? It's still worth getting something that might disappoint you. It's worth getting something that you might think sucks. Now, there's been for a couple of years, and I think we're finally slowly starting to get out of this silly period where I think like the primary concern that people had, largely thanks to all these sorts of groups like Fandom Menace and stuff like that. The main concern was, well, a continuation of EU is going to be, it's going to be woke, or whatever sort of thing you're supposed to think about modern culture these days. And the bigger concern, the thing that I find totally legitimate, is that people might be worried about the quality. People might think that, yeah, for just a variety of reasons, it's just not worth experimenting with, right? Why get something that sucks? Like maybe it is worth sort of trapping the EU in amber, as it were, right? Sort of like protected from having anything worse done to it, right? And I get that, but at the same time, the EU ended in a way that I think deserves some continuation, even if it's to conclude a set of storylines, right? And there's pros and cons to that. As a quick aside, for years I've been a big proponent of what happened in the Star Trek literary universe. And just as a quick background about that, for about 20 plus years, minimum, and you can go back even further and find various sorts of threads in earlier Star Trek books that connect up with this for it, but a good solid 20 years, there was, despite what lots of people think about Star Trek relative to Star Wars EU, there was a relatively tightly interconnected storyline that weaved in and out of multiple series, right? All of the tie-ins to the television shows, in addition to original series created just for print that told an overall storyline that had massive payoff at various points that unfortunately in around 2019 came to an abrupt end with the announcement of something like the Picard television show, which was going to, for the first time, start telling television and movie stories set at a period of time that the books had been handling. And we just knew that they weren't going to sort of do anything to kind of tie that in, right? So a lot like what JJ did to Star Wars by ending the EU in order to sort of have the supposed freedom to tell these new stories, Star Trek did the same thing, wanting the freedom to tell these Paramount Plus stories with Picard and everything else and Discovery. They ended the literary continuity that fans had been following for 20 plus years, the thing that was keeping Star Trek going in the way that the EU was always the thing keeping Star Wars going in between and after the films. Thankfully, a few years after this, some of the authors, again, the pillars holding up the Star Trek fandom, right, and keeping the books in print in continuity with one another, pitched and proposed to the licensees that there should be something like an ending. Now, for years, I have heralded this as a triumph and a roadmap for what the EU could get. At the minimum, something like a continuation, something that bridges Crucible to Legacy, something that maybe gives us a series of sort of micro conclusions, micro pays off, like tell us, give us the outline for Force Unleashed 3, and so on and so forth, right? Tell us more about the Old Republic era. Do more to make sense of some of the contradictions coming to the Clone Wars era. Give us something like a set of conclusions, and then maybe we'll be fine. Now, there's pros and cons to this. As much as I've been public about what a great idea this was, I've never talked much about the reality of the conclusion we got. And there are two problems with it. One is that I don't entirely like the story. Yes, it gave us a conclusion, and there's something to be said about that. We now have a bookend, right? And that's good. They continued to conclude it, but they also concluded it in such a way that it really is gone for good. And so there's something bittersweet about that. So they listened to the fans, and the writers themselves were fans. They wanted to see this thing seen through, right? But the story we got and the way in which the story concludes it so finally, it is kind of sad to say that it really is gone for good. And at least with the EU, we get these drips and drops of continuation, but we have no conclusion yet. There is always that hope, right? There's always that hope. And that's why I always say there's nothing in principle standing in the way, regardless of what you think about the desirability or the feasibility now under current management. Nothing in principle stands in the way of at some point getting some formal continuation of the EU. Whereas Star Trek did, on the one hand, a good thing by continuing to conclude to satisfy that fan base and to make sense of the overall storyline. Again, they concluded it so ultimately that it's now done, right? So I just don't read Star Trek books much anymore. So that's kind of sad. But getting back to this. So again, I recognize, it's all to say, I recognize what Scott recognizes, which is that there's multiple sides of this issue. And the skepticism, the healthy skepticism that some fans have about continuation, what it might look like, is understandable, even if I think it's still worth pressing on and arguing for it in principle anyway. But he gets to the present here. It can't be taken for granted that continuation in 2024 would be like the EU of 2014 and prior. And I think that's a really good point to make. A lot's changed, right? Lots of fans see this alone is enough of a reason to not want more EU, especially since the quality of this new canon Star Wars content under Disney, in their opinion, has been inferior. And again, I wouldn't know because I don't follow it, right? Don't like to take a stand on that, but that's certainly the perception of many. And again, that's entirely fair. That's their point of view, right? So there's skepticism grounded in empirics, and that's healthy, and that's fine. And I don't want to argue people's points of view about that. But as much as any of us would prefer an EU exactly as it was 76 to 2014, many circumstances today make this unlikely. So, a major difference is that instead of the EU being the sole continuation of the saga, it would now be one of two continuities, right? Of course, the canon would likely receive most of the story project content and related complementary materials such as games and action figures, magazines, etc. Some fans, Scott included, would struggle to ever get to a point where the EU could ever be the same as it was again without being the main focus of Star Wars, because not everything would be connected in continuity as it was before, only what is deemed Legends or EU. And this would be a major departure from what had been previously, where all of the ancillary material played a key role. But another key difference is that Lucasfilm has a much bigger budget. And after the prequel films concluded, there was a shift in the EU where the novels and comics started to take a support role to things like Filoni's Clone Wars, right? Now the Star Wars brand is primarily driven by multiple television shows since they are the biggest potential drivers of revenue. And while novels, comics, games remain, they now play an even larger role in supporting television. They exist to sort of stand up and support that stuff, right? And I've made this point for years, right? Which is that one of the fascinating sort of technological sort of entertainment cultural shifts that occurred that in some sense might have spelled some inevitable doom for the EU back in 2014 is that everything's moving digital. The book market's changing, the comics market's in decline, and just taking Disney, there is a huge arms race for every entertainment company to build up a streaming platform, and it's largely been sort of supposed by lots of analysts that what Disney's hoping to do is to build the biggest damn streaming app, not to succeed the streaming wars, but in some sense to simply drown out all the competition, even if they don't even in the long term want to continue with streaming. That, in other words, so much of what you see now with like the new canon stuff, like pumping out show after show, and again, I don't follow it, but you can't help but sort of pick this up through osmosis, the Mandalorian and Boba Fett and the Acolyte and things like this, right? They've even put the movies on the back seat. It's about pushing as much people and as much content onto these streaming platforms, and naturally, all the other stuff's going to fall to the wayside. Now, there's a major exception, which Scott gets into here, which is the High Republic, which is sort of it's got a little bit more of the pre-2014 EU feel, where it's like here is kind of an independent original book and comic series, and fair enough, right? But primarily, so much of what the sort of the post 2014, what I guess you'd call the Disney EU is, it's about its media tie-in to streaming content, right? It's not like what we had prior to 2014, which was, with the exception of some movies, the major exception of some movies and a couple television shows, Star Wars was the expanded universe, right? So things have interestingly sort of flip-flopped in that way. The media landscape is just so different. So it's interesting. He sort of supposes, if based on this current model, it's probable that if the EU were continued, it would be primarily based around a television show or cartoon, as was the case with Star Wars Visions. Under this possibility, any books or comics could largely be in support of this theoretical EU show. So it's interesting to theorize that, given the model, right, even as expensive as it might be and as big of a risk as it might be from the perspective of people who only 10 years ago booted the EU, maybe bringing it back maybe makes it look like a TV show, right? But then there's just going to be some continuing EU material that sort of just exists to sort of tie into that TV show. Again, he says the major exception is the model of the High Republic, which I just mentioned, comprised of novels and comics. It's a publisher-only multimedia three-phase project, began in 2020. Since the EU is an entirely different continuity than the new canon, it would share some resemblances with the High Republic project, right? And I think that makes sense. But on the whole, I think that the model that he's referring to, of sort of like it being a television show or something, I think lots of sense given the landscape, the media landscape, and sort of the push to streaming and everything like that. But if continuation were only books or comics, how would that look? One possibility is to simply release stories either already completed or to finish works that were in the process of 2014. And to me, this is just like the slam dunk, right? And occasionally I'll see pushback from some of the licensees themselves, and they think, oh, you fans think it's so easy. Oh, sure, it's just, back up the Brinks trucks, free money. We just get to sort of like, put the stuff out. I don't know why they say, I mean, they've got these things ready to go, right? There must be other reasons why they don't want to, but it's true. There's stuff that's in the vault and there's stuff that's in process. There's stuff we all know about, and there's stuff we're all actually clamoring for, right? So for example, he says, we know Escape from Dagu was finished and is available, right? And can be published officially by Lucasfilm if it ever chooses. It's also possible that There were other finished works, and we hear about these things all the time, and we're always finding about lost little bits and pieces and essays and whatnot, right? But there are full-scale books out there and other books sort of in progress that we might have access to. Another possibility is to create stories that are designed to wrap up the loose ends. Completely agree. I also mentioned this, and I think it's right. I mean, Force Unleashed 2 ends on a cliffhanger. Does it mean we need Force Unleashed 3 as a video game? No, but it could be a comic. It could be a book. And in any event, there's a story that needs to be told. There's a story that needs to be continued, right? We've got to bridge the gap between Crucible and Legacy, obviously. Both these possibilities, however, ultimately lead to a conclusion like in 2014, where the EU once again would end. And I think that's right. I completely agree with this. This is the yin and the yang of it, right? We continue it, unfortunately, potentially to inevitably end it, to conclude it, right? Where then we will never have hope of it continuing, right? Because it's like, if you got to be careful what you wish for, right? If Lucasfilm does at some point say, we're going to continue it with a mini series, but we're going to end it once and for all, you got to be prepared for that, right? I have to say, though, given how badly they messaged the decanonization in 2014, there's almost some sense in which I'd be happy with that, right? Just as an aside, because that message, that ham-fisted message, so incoherent, it it really radicalized, I think, a generation of Star Wars fans to just wonder what the hell's going on, right? And I genuinely feel like if they had messaged that better and said, this is what we want to do, and we recognize that we're ending this midstream, and maybe down the road there'll be something like, at the minimum, we're not going to like turn the full sort of cultural might of Lucasfilm against you EU fans, right? And send waves of angry people online after you, right? But like, we really believe in what we're going to do next, and we really want to make the case to you, right? That would be one thing. But instead, it was kind of like, yep, midstream. We know you got projects in production, but yeah, sorry, we want you to watch 3 movies that, on the whole, aren't going to be really well regarded by Star Wars fans, and the trade off is that you lose 37 years of continuity. I mean, it's just so anything would be anything would be better. He goes on, Scott, the topic of continuity for the EU, if it were to be continued, would be an important one. We still aren't sure about the current state of the holocron database. And this is something Scott's talked about a lot for a couple of years, and it's a critical point. We take for granted that there's even processes inside to track continuity over various projects, over various licensees, right? We don't, I mean, heck, we don't even really know where Leland Shee is. I mean, is he still around? Is he still on social media? What happened to him? What happened to the database? Is it getting updated? We don't know. If it is, are there multiple databases? Is there a holocron just for Canon, a holocron just for the EU? What processes need to exist internally to keep the licensees on the straight and narrow? I mean, we know that there's a story group, but that's a Canon story group, right? Would there be an EU story group? Would we need that, right? Or could we rely on other resources to make sure that all the licensees and the content added up? It's an interesting question. These are questions that need to be asked, right? And are part of sort of a more nuanced conversation about continuation in general. It doesn't appear that Leland Shee, if he is still the one in charge, which again we don't know, is actively involved with the game, referring to the Old Republic. Therefore, there are well-founded reasons to be skeptical that the holocron still exists, but it would be absolutely necessary, or something like it, right, if the EU were to be continued properly in continuity with itself. One could theorize that if the holocron no longer existed or needed substantial updating and restoration, it could be a barrier to Lucasfilm considering continuing the EU. Such a task could be seen as expensive or burdensome, simply for a licensee to have to use to write comics or books. It's a good point, right? Possible solution to this would be to utilize us, the fans, right? There are lots of projects out there that already sort of do that work and have been updating all the time. He mentions a couple here, Timeline Gold. I know there's a lot of skepticism around Wikipedia for sure, but discussion boards, force.net, right, and a lot of other places. It's true that EU fandom has built up many different helpful resources, both for fan engagement and with each other and with the EU, including this very website, expanduniverse.com, that he's currently writing for. So there's lots of resources out there that could, in some sense, kind of provide some additional help, right, sort of fan help, in the way that, like, many, many years before the database, that's what happened too, right? It was fans. It was fans who had the knowledge, who were able to assist the licensees in keeping continuity together. Now to future prospects. Scott says, well, these websites may serve to both facilitate fan engagement with the new future EU continuation and serve as a technical resource for continuity. I sometimes wonder if they're working in the most efficient manner to serve these purposes. For example, the last few years have been, and this has to be underscored, it's something Scott and I talk about from time to time, offline. A golden era for lost works coming to light. Although none of these are technically officially declared EU, and others are still in process, like the Hungarian Han Solo novel translations. But we've seen Heart of the Jedi, Praying for Time, Lightsider, Tales from the Front, Journalian Expedition, Planet Hoppers Kashyyyk. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? The super duper expanded edition of Supernatural Encounters, Escape from Callus. I mean, all released or leaked in the last just 2, 3 years. But there's been very little discussion or analysis of these new stories on these platforms so far. Obviously, Heart of the Jedi got the most amount of attention. It got some attention in 2015, 2016 when it was being released on Joe's site, and then 2016 when there was a very brief Lulu publication run. But then again, of course, in 2021 when it was back on Amazon, it was a major Star Wars story in and outside the expanded universe. This was a major mainstream Star Wars story. That Heart of the Jedi, a lost novel, was available for people to buy on Amazon and reaching, the heights of the top of the Amazon sales charts. This was a big deal. And I don't know if it's that because there's something about it being a book, something more substantial that really got people's attention, was the fact that it was this basically complete thing from a Bantam era that people are nostalgic for. I don't know what, but not only have we gotten all these amazing stories that, again, on the whole, the mainstream, even the EU fandom, sure, there's people that have talked about this, people excited about this, myself included, but nowhere near the level of Heart of Jedi excitement. But I think the thing that's most striking is like Lightsider. Scott and I talk about this. I mean, of all the things we've gotten, that's probably one of the most amazing things to come out. The lost sequel to Dark Empire by Tom Veitch. Everyone now finally in the mainstream has access to that. And I feel like we just haven't had a Heart of the Jedi moment about it yet. And obviously with Supernatural Encounters, we get this amazing super duper edition of a book. And there's just tons of fans that want to like tear it down and spread misinformation about it. Now, by the way, anyone who reads it is entitled to their negative opinion. Don't let me be clear. But it just feels like we're just at a weird point. I think Scott is right to highlight this, that something's funky when we've got all these resources and we've got this fandom that we built for 10 years. And yet, like, I don't know, somehow it's clouded us to like somehow none of that's like helped like boost the reality that it really is a golden era. We're in a golden time of getting lost stuff released just the last couple of years. And I don't think people appreciate that. So for anyone who, again, lacks any sort of like faith that there's any hope for this as a fandom, right? You can argue about continuation, its feasibility, even its desirability. But as of right now, the last couple of years, there's a lot of good reading out there. And I don't even know if it's really caught up. It certainly hasn't caught up to the mainstream Star Wars fandom. And I think a lot of the EU fandom still needs, frankly, to catch up. It's just a fascinating observation. I think he's right about. We should consider making the most of these resources to re-energize, reprioritize efforts to align with our goals, whether they be fan engagement, discussion analysis, news and current events, archival presentation of data such as author interviews, timeline database projects, etc. All of these resource platforms are and will be essential in a post-continuation world if it ever happens. Consider how mainstay website hubs like theforce.net and even EU namesake sites like clubj.net made an absolute about face suddenly and changed their coverage and focus from the EU to the new canon as soon as it was announced. Boy, and Club J, that was just that was rough. Even though the person behind Club J had always been a little iffy, and particularly sort of in like those last couple of years, it started to throw a little bit of mud on the EU and stuff like that. But boy, was there an about face just in general, to the point that, like, again, Club Jade, obviously obviously named after Mara Jade. I mean, you'd have no sense anymore, right, that there was any sort of love for the EU. It's it was just a shocking period of time for anybody who wasn't there, for anybody who didn't experience that turnover from April 24th to April 26th, 2014. It was a absolute whirlwind. But even sites like Star Wars Timeline Gold, which is an amazing resource, started new canon timelines in addition to maintaining their old EU material. So EU resources websites, even as decentralized as they are now, within our networks of private discords and YouTube channels and Facebook groups and things like that, Scott says, should be ready to provide coverage to new EU if and when it comes about. The process of preparation should start now, be ready for when something like that comes about, right? And we've had these test runs when, on the one hand, A Heart of the Jedi comes out, and I think as a fandom, we did a pretty darn good job of spreading the word. But like with some of these short stories that have come out, these lost short stories that are amazing finds, it's like not so much. So like something's amiss, right? So there's a lot to do now, I think, to kind of like get better at promoting this stuff and promoting how great it still is to be an EU fan and how much new stuff there is still. So that imagine when continuation comes and we're really ready, right? To spread the word to the masses. Scott says, I say this not as a criticism or in claiming to have all the answers, but as a call for ideas. I do, however, hope these factors be considered in a manner that makes our efforts as productive, as engaging as possible for EU fans and serves our best interests, whatever they may be, as we hopefully await or dread the prospect of more EU to come. So it's a great article. I wanted to do this to make sure that people saw this article. I don't know what sort of feedback he got or what attention it's gotten, but I hope this at least gets the 10 more people who are watching this now to sort of read it and to think about that stuff. And I think in general to sort of, never shy away from talking about continuation. It's, again, I want to be clear, it's okay to disagree with the idea of continuation. But I'm interested in your reasons, right? Like, let's have that debate, but I sort of think it's something to talk about, never take for granted that it's something you can talk about. Like, it's, from time to time, people are going to give up on the idea as new waves of people come into the fandom who weren't around prior to 2014. They may not even think that this is possible or something, right? So keep the idea out there. But I think what Scott's essay helps us to do is to think not only about the arguments for continuation, which at this point most of you fans can pretty reflexively regurgitate pretty easily, but I think he forces us to start thinking very realistically and practically about what's feasible, what's desirable in the context of what's feasible, and what sorts of things can we do now to promote the little bits of continuation we're actually already getting, right? So that we can be prepared to really be an engaged fandom when continuation eventually comes. Again, I like, as he says at the end, while we wait or dread what continuation can look like, because there are pros and cons, right? And I recognize that. So I'm seeing there's a couple of comments here. Good to see everyone. Alex, Marcel, I am alive. I made it. People are unhappy Disney is pulling from the EU. I am more concerned that the EU will be pulling from Disney. That's an interesting point. I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I hear that from time to time. There's already a little bit of concern, like with the Old Republic, and some of the expansions. Like, there's been some weird like kind of what's the word? Like kind of well, some people think that there might be a little bit like of the new stuff getting pulled in weird ways and very sort of subtle ways and stuff, and it's a concern. It's definitely a concern. I've said from the beginning that for a long time there was, after 2014, there was this movement to be like, oh, like make Mara Jade canon, right? Or and stuff, which, by the way, even grammatically didn't make sense. It's not that they get made canon, it's that they get introduced. A character named Mara Jade with similar sorts of characteristics gets introduced into this new continuity, right? But I used to say, why argue that, right? Why would someone want to see that? I want to see it would be like telling a new canon fan, like, oh, like, we can't wait till like Kylo Ren ends up in like an EU story. It just doesn't make sense, right? So again, I don't want to see it. I want to keep the continuities free from each other, right? In parallel and never in a sort of intersecting or integrating. But I know that that's a concern people have, right? At the same time, I think the way that this could be done in a way that, like, again, when you see Dash Rendar's ship in Rebels or whatever it was, right? It doesn't mean that anything about our Dash Rendar or anything about any of his EU stories is now a part of the Disney canon. It just means that there is this similar looking thing that happens to be now introduced into that continuity. And the same would be true if, just taking the stupidest possible example, if like BB-8 ended up as a character in Force Unleashed 3 or something, right? It would be stupid. I don't know why you'd want to do that. No one's asking for that, but it would just be a character that happens to resemble this soccer ball looking thing over in the new canon that's now just been introduced in the EU for the first time. So it's not even it wouldn't be as if Disney is coming into the EU. It would be that some EU contributor thinks that there's some value introducing this stupid little character into the EU, but it's a different character. It's the EU's version of this thing. But I agree with you. I wouldn't want to see that, and I would be concerned about that too. I'd like to think, though, that if continuation happened, it would be done by contributors, authors and writers and whatnot, artists and stuff, who are doing it because they love and know something about the EU, right? So they wouldn't just think, aha, I know what to do. I want to pull something from this new stuff in. They'd think, great, a chance to continue on the stories that I grew up with, right? And that's what we sort of saw with Marvel 108, with Matthew Rosenberg. I mean, this was someone who knew his Marvel comics and didn't have any interest in telling a story set in the new stuff. He wanted to continue the Marvel stories, and that's exactly what he did. And I think it showed. Um, but but I think it is a fair concern, particularly given when we think about continuation happening right now. And I think the thing that I haven't said in this stream yet is that if continuation happens, I don't think it happens for a really long time now at this point, right? I mean, clearly the thing that needs to change, the structural problem, is current Lucasfilm leadership. And I don't say that because I have anything personal against. I'm not someone who thinks Kathleen Kennedy ruined my childhood. I don't go there anymore. The reason I say that is clearly the people in charge are the people who dumped the EU 10 years ago. So they have already told us what they think about continuation implicitly, right? I think that this isn't something that happens for a long time. It happens in a Disney slash Lucasfilm era with different people altogether, right? And I think that's one reason why I think it would be fair to be skeptical about it happening now, but I don't think it's going to happen now, right? It's only going to happen if the people change. And anyway, so yeah, um, good. I can't wait for you to do that. It's all right here. And if you ever, it's all triple parked up here, the Star Trek EU. So looking forward to talking about it. Scott, hello. Thank you for writing the article. I know we talked a bit about it this weekend, and I just had some time this morning. I just thought I want to talk about it, and I want others to hear about it. Um, oh man, I agree. How Lucasfilm didn't capitalize on the phenomena makes me scratch my head. Completely agree with that. It's crazy, and either by, I mean, they could have undercut all of the stuff happening at Lulu and Amazon by putting it out themselves. Um, and the licensees too, right? Or whoever it is that claims to own it now, right? But at the minimum, they could have. And by the way, they may not at this point, right? Which is one reason why I think Flint felt comfortable sort of letting it be released, because I think at this point, I think the contract's basically sort of been null and void by the complete inaction of the licensees and parent company to do anything with it, right? So I think those rights, I think, legitimately did revert. But clearly in the case of things that they believe they still own that are in midstream, or like, again, take Dagu or something, right? Again, even that, I think at this point, I think the contract there is probably null and void, I think, just given the inaction. But yeah, why not take advantage? Look at that and say, geez, Louise, there is a powerful demand for this type of thing. And we've got some things in the vault, right? Or we'll bring the EU back in some way. I mean, any number of things. I'm surprised they didn't even do an even more selfish move and do something like these third-party print-on-demand websites are facilitating all this, like what they might consider sort of like, counterfeit sort of like uploads and stuff. Let's just buy Lulu. You know what I mean? Disney's got the money. Just buy Lulu and then let EU fans run wild, right? But they didn't do that either. Go figure. Not that I want to give them any ideas. Well, that's what some would argue. Supernatural Encounters has a way of sort of trying to make sense of all this, and it was very subtle, which is not easy for online fandom to understand. So yeah, yeah. Well, that's it. I gotta run. So thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.